Yes, we can.
Yes,
Okay,
we
great.
can.
Okay, I'm just going to actually, sorry, I just want to share the other screen. Fusion here. Sorry. To reshare, and I want to share that screen. Excellent. Okay, guys, thank you very much for having me this morning. Just want to see that. Okay, I imagine that we're seeing the Splosh logo in the background. Is that correct?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, fantastic. Well, thank you very much for having me today and for inviting me to talk. Firstly, a little bit about some of the work that's being done by colleagues and myself in the Southern Hemisphere relating to a focus group funded by INQA called Splosh. And then, of course, to look a little bit about at some of the research that's being done by my own research group in the Southeast African continental margin. So to talk a little bit about Splosh, Splosh relates to submerged paleo-landscapes of the Southern Hemisphere. It's an INQA-funded focus group, and its aim is to spread awareness of submerged landscapes that are unique to the Southern Hemisphere. So we know that there's very little known about the shelves of the Southern Hemisphere if we compare to our Northern Hemispheric counterparts, apart from Australia perhaps. Yet we know that the Southern Hemisphere is host to a number of oceanic islands, coastlines, etc. that have diverse widths and gradients, climates, and of course sea level histories. So the uniqueness of these climates, etc., act to play out quite differently in terms of the paleo-landscape preservation and exposure that we may find. So, sorry guys, I'm just having a, there we go. What we find here then is that we have many unique opportunities for submerged landscape research on this basis. And in particular, relating these to climate, geological setting, etc., is the fact that we know there's a broad array of indigenous groups that have used coastal resources associated with lower than present sea levels, going all the way back to the initial out of Africa phase of human evolution. So very, very exciting work for the Southern Hemisphere. A really good example of this is some of the work done on the Southern Cape Coast of South Africa, which shows a paleo-coastal geography that's dramatically different to that of present, and one that's been known to be utilized by early modern human beings. We look at some of the other examples, particularly from southwestern Australia and southeast coast of South Africa. A lot of the shorelines and the submerged landscapes that we see provide a very good ability for us to look through to the present. The landscapes that are preserved in spectacular form, and they're associated with the post-glacial transgression. We find that these are exceptionally well preserved and exposed due to the strong diagenetic conditioning that we experience typically in the subtropics here. So a lot of the Southern Hemisphere, that's exactly where we sit. So we see things expressing themselves as beach rocks or aeolianites, and the forms that they preserve are really providing us with an excellent glimpse into what past conditions were like. So with all of this in mind, our Splosh working group aims to explore the following. So how does the greater oceanic area of the Southern Hemisphere influence submerged landscapes from their nature and their preservation? And how do we study these? How can these incorporate concerns that are related to indigenous knowledges, traditions, etc.? So for those people that have used lower than present sea levels for resources, and how is this then incorporated into submerged landscape research? And then how do we take the different biogeographical perspectives from the Southern Hemisphere, and how do these influence our understanding of human migration and coastal resource use? So a fairly broad blanket around which we're looking at submerged landscapes, but the key thing to start with is the identification of these landscapes. And that is where we've really had a very good, wholesome partnership with the guys in Neptune. So Neptune is a fairly strong Northern Hemisphere dominated group. And it's been excellent for us to meet just firstly as team leaders between the two groups and discuss our various bits of research, but also again to take part in co-hosted workshops. So the most recent one was a Neptune and Splosh hosted workshop called Shine, in which we showcased various aspects of submerged research, submerged landscape research from both Southern and Northern Hemispheres. It's good for us to broadcast our ideas to those in the Northern Hemisphere. And likewise, it's good for us to take the key technological advances that Neptune is putting forward and to try and internalize and use those for our own research. So very, very fruitful collaboration, and hopefully one that continues well into the future. We have a diverse number of team leaders. So I'm not the team leader for Splosh. I'm just here to be the spokesperson for today. It's actually Ingrid Ward, who is our principal investigator from the University of Western Australia. And as you can see, we've got a diverse set of people from all around the Southern Hemisphere, so making this quite a healthy and vibrant working space for those of us that are looking at submerged landscape research here. So if anyone is interested in further work that we're doing, please do contact myself or Ingrid or any of the other team leaders. I think Haley will be presenting later today, so please do get in touch. So I'm going to take you now from the broad, and I'm going to go through to a specific case study that we're doing from northern Mozambique, looking at some of the stratigraphy there. So some background knowledge to this. My research group is investigating a number of these embayments with associated incised valleys and development of particular stratigraphies from all the way in the north in Kenya to southern Mozambique in the south and to the southwest parts of Madagascar. The principal thing here is we're looking at the stratigraphic records, so what sort of facies models can we see here, but also importantly, what sea level indicators that we can find for reconstruction of lower than present sea level records. The reason being is it's not a glaciated margin. The GIA is relatively close to, when it's modeled, to that of what we presume to be global mean sea level change. And so, you know, these are excellent far field sites in which we can start to unravel major changes in sea level. And in particular, as we see today, presumed changes in sea level relating to meltwater pulses. So let's get to it. The study area itself is, and I must say, Gaia, your pronunciation was a lot better than mine. When I first heard of this place, I was calling it Machimboa de Praia. So it's Machimboa de Praia, or Machimboa, as you would say, probably more legitimate than myself. This is in northeastern Mozambique. The area itself is upper mesotidal to perhaps lower macrotidal, so average of 3.1 meters tidal range, but during springs it's a little bit higher, pushes it into the 4-point-something meter category. So very strong tidal currents developed in the area. We find that it's also extremely limited with regards wave energy. We get the occasional tropical cyclone, but what happens is that we end up producing a situation where it's sheltered from most of that due to these coralline islands that are sitting to seawards of the embayment. We find the embayment itself is bedrock framed. It's fringed mostly with corals, and then we have mangroves and mud or sand flats that are the most prominent unconsolidated sediments in the area. If we look from borehole reconstruction and seismic reconstruction, we find that the whole system is underlain mostly by bedrock. So it's not incised into sediments, rather we have incised valleys that are incising into bedrock. That bedrock we see from cores as well as from outcrop along the shorelines. It's outcropping Cretaceous siltstones of the Mikandani Formation. And it's into this Mikandani Formation that we have several bedrock hosted incised valleys that are related to the last glacial maximum that have been incised into the area. When we look at these from seismic perspective, so we've collected a lot of seismic data in the area, we find that the main incised valley is up to about 40 meters deep. We see that this is filled mostly with gaseous media, so it's typically very fine sediment, muddy sediment when we've taken jet probes and cores. That's the kind of thing that hosts and traps, obviously, biogenic gas. So this gaseous media tends to obscure some of the seismic signal, but we do know that we can see subordinate channels that incise into this, as well as the fact that when we have clear records, and you can see over here, there is some clarity in the record here, we find that we have relatively low or alternating high to low amplitude draped type reflection packages. Those are classic, and it's muddy at least, classic indications of a central basin type fill, which is typical of not so much tide dominated estuaries or incised valleys, but mixed tide and wave or wave dominated systems, which is kind of unusual when you're looking at the macro tidal framework here. Interestingly now, if we look at the rest of the stratigraphy resting atop the central basin fills, we have an extraordinarily thick package of sandy material that's developed. The sandy material, again, we've probed it with jet probes. We find that it has both landward and seaward dipping reflections. These seaward dipping reflections and landward dipping reflections basically are fairly high angle. They look quite strongly progradational in both senses. These things associate with the narrowing of the bedrock margins of the embayment. I'll show you a figure of that in a second. So where the actual bedrock hosted cliffs and that sort of thing form the embayment itself, where this narrows, we find that this large body of sediment is associated with that. When we look at these from a seismic stratigraphic perspective, we interpret them to be tidal deltaic complexes. We have an ebb and a flood tide delta that's preserved. There's small little tidal channels that are incised into the tops. So it's actually this package right over here, sorry, that I'm talking to here. You can see very strong progradational reflectors here. And that's the kind of thing that we're considering to be this fairly large, buried, submerged tidal delta complex. Interestingly, if we look further, what this does is these tidal delta complexes abut and actually locally steepen against fairly large bioherms that we can see in the seismics that are anchored onto the bedrock substrate. So these bioherms are either coralline or fairly large oyster incrustations. And these are acting to, in ways, geologically control some of the thickness of these fairly large scale deltaic complexes that we see. If we look overall at these complexes, what they do is they produce a seaward thinning wedge of sandy material. So we can see that quite nicely here. It's very difficult to image it to landward here just because the tidal delta complex that is now the modern tidal delta complex is essentially too shallow to survey over. We presume that it would taper off in this direction as well. And what we presume is that this is being partially sequestered into the existing sandy intertidal and muddy intertidal deposits here. If I go back one or two in the stratigraphy here, in particular, we can see overlying this is almost what appears to be a semi-reworked portion of the spit that lies below, sorry, the tidal complex that lies below. And we think that as sea level has risen, part of this has taken some of this material. We can see some erosion at the top parts here and has started to feed this into the sandy intertidal deposits that we find now in the area. Interestingly, if we look now to the actual tidal channels themselves with the multi-beam bathymetry, we find that these things themselves are quite limited in terms of the sediment cover. So we have bedrock cropping out, that's basically beach rocks that are cropping out all along here. Oh, fine, sorry, that should be a thin veneer of sediment. The main tidal channels here are basically fringed completely and dominated by beach rock. So that's a strong geological control now on how the system is behaving. So those beach rocks are quite important. They have a consistent elevation. They step both landwards and up in elevation from the spits. The top set of those spits typically is about 15 meters below sea level. The beach rocks themselves, if we move slightly landwards, we find are sitting at a consistent elevation throughout the system of about -7 meters. They're very clear in that they form a very hard pinnacled surface. So these are the beach rocks here, this little unit over here, M, that you can see up the top here. They create these little pinnacles. This is what they look like in the multi-beam bathymetry. You can see pinnacles, very hard looking surface. Again, when we've jet probed these things, the material that comes out is mostly shelly conglomeratic material with the occasional sandstone as well. Interestingly, when we look at these under the microscope, they have similar high magnesium calcite content to the rocks that we find in the intertidal. So again, we find beach rocks sitting here at essentially presuming mean sea level, intertidal. And that in itself too has a relatively high magnesium calcite value. So we think these are relatively good relative sea level indicators for analysis for later sea level reconstruction. So to briefly take you through what we think's been happening in terms of the model for development of the system, we've had incision of valleys during the last glacial maximum. So a valley would have incised out, and now this is being deepened and transgressed during the the post-glacial transgression. What's happened is this has rapidly deepened the valley itself, flooded into the valley and produced this mixed wave and tide dominated setting to bring about the development of the central basin type fill. What it's done too is it's drowned the sets of bioherms that have developed over here, and eventually we've actually pushed a whole lot of nice material over that to form this central basin type drape. If we look at one step further, we've deepened we've deepened the valley quite quickly through a rapid transgression. In order for us to start to produce relatively large complexes like spits or deltas, that sort of thing, we need to slow sea level down. We need to get it in equilibrium with everything in the area in terms of the energy processes. And this is what we presume has happened here. We've started to produce a relatively big ebb and flood tide delta complex. This is located coincidentally also with the pinch point between rocky promontories on either side of the embayment. So basically where the shoreline anchored here, we started to produce a relatively slow rising shoreline, slowly migrating shoreline. This is in equilibrium with everything. And not only that, but this pinch point has acted to increase tidal flows due to tidal constriction. What that's doing is it started to produce a relatively big body of sediment. that substantial volume of sediment is likely to be one of the factors for its preservation. A large body of sediment, when stepped over by sea level, if it's large enough, it requires a lot of inertial reactivation of that sediment to completely remove it. If it's big, it can actually just remain there mostly. Interestingly, though, we see that the top set rollover of these deltas is almost entirely preserved to seaward. So this would be it right over here, sitting at about minus 15 meters, the top sets of these things. We see beach rock developing out here at minus 8. So if we preserve the top sets of these features, what it implies is that we've had a very limited reworking of a sandy delta form. Sand's very easily moved by transgressing sea levels. So what we find rather is that we've preserved this in situ through a situation where we've overstepped that shoreline. This rapid rise in sea level from about minus 15 to minus 8 meters corresponds with the slowing down of sea level gain at minus 8 meters and the development of beach rock sitting slightly further landward. So we see it here sitting in our model. We can see where the beach rock shorelines are. That's essentially what our paleogeographic situation would have looked like. And then basically we have risen sea level up again relatively quickly over that to produce another little amount of underneath this central basin type fill. And then basically our reconfiguration to what everything looks like today with our intertidal areas and mangroves stabilizing our shorelines at present. So in summation, our central basin deposits over here are related to what we consider to have been a relatively quick jump in sea level, a rapid deepening of the incised valley form. So that would relate to what we're thinking is to meltwater pulse 1C. We're just waiting to get new material to date things with. Most of that's organic material. You can't really rely on that too much. We pick up a slow stand period from southern Mozambique that we ascribe to this period where we've produced these lovely tidal deltas, the same depth, same sort of timing, we presume. We mark again then this rapid deepening to a point where we've overstepped these to where we slowed sea level down and we preserved the submerged beach rock. We built this delta out. It's overstepped, we think, during perhaps meltwater pulse 1B, and we've stabilized again at 8 meters. Importantly, what we see here is the site remains a key target for dating, particularly for far-field submerged sea level indicators. The problem being is that this area is now overcome by ISIS forces. So our very last bit of surveying was followed up by guys taking a few pot shots at the vessel with AK-47s. So we're not going back anytime soon, but this is definitely on our wish list for future dating of sea level indicators. So what we revealed from here really is that our sedimentological, seismic, and geomorphological evidence shows again stepped sea level rise during the mid to late Holocene. It's a good alternative to coral-based records and especially useful from this tectonically stable far-field site. And really interestingly for me, we can preserve large quantities of sandy sediment in their stratigraphy, which is something that's not often seen in the tide-dominated models for incised valley development. And this could be a key source of beach nourishment and or hydrocarbons from the ancient record. That being said, I'd like to say thank you again very much. I hope I've kept to time. I do see I've got a little bit of time left here, so if there are any questions, please don't hesitate to ask.
Thank you so much, Andy. We are very happy to collaborate with Splosh, and we hope to organize the other joint event in the future as soon as possible. Also because Shine was a very exciting event in which we had the opportunity to visit fantastic landscape, coastal landscapes around the world. Okay, there are some questions for Andy. Are there some questions from the audience?
I have a question.
Oh, perfect.
Can you hear me?
Thank you, Matteo.
I'd say, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Very interesting, actually, your presentation, because as you know, it's always complex to find very long relative sea level reconstruction especially in far field sites. So I have a couple of questions. The first is methodological. So you said that you found these big beach rock outcrops that are about 7 meters thick. Do you think this is a sort of multiple beach rock deposition during a particular period, or do you think it's something like